Hey everyone, Kevin here with Victory 4x4. Today in the garage we're going to be installing our strike rear bumper on this second gen Toyota Sequoia. So before your new bumper can go on, we obviously have to do some tear down and disassembly here on the vehicle. Basically, we're working to remove the entire plastic rear bumper fascia off of the truck. For that, most of it can be done with just a couple 10mm sockets and a panel or clip tool. If you don't have one of these, that's fine. You can get by with a flat screwdriver there. You can really start anywhere. There's hardware kind of all the way around this thing. We're going to jump over to the driver's side wheel opening over here and start out with removing the mud flap. So for these, again, you need that 10mm socket. Basically what you have is 7 screws throughout the inside here, and then 2 more down underneath on the back side that need to be removed. Once you pull the last screw, these things pretty much just fall off and out of the way. So if it feels like it's hung up for any reason, you probably missed one in there somewhere. So take a second look. No, too many words. Once you take out the final screw, these things pretty much fall right off and out of the way, and you can repeat that process over on the other side. Now you can do this now or right after you get all of your hardware out when it comes time to pulling this fascia off. But with most of those screws out of the way, you can grab this and kind of pull it out and off of the clip there and start getting it out of the retainer along this side. And then we'll move underneath to remove some fasteners along the back side here. So under here we have one more of those hex head screws out here toward the side. And then as you come in closer to the center or the hitch receiver in here, you should have one more hex head screw right here, which ours is already removed because that one broke due to the wonders of rust and corrosion during our initial disassembly. Now over here on the passenger side, you should have those same 2 hex head screws that need to be removed, along with 3 plastic retainers here around the exhaust opening. This is where your flat screwdriver or your panel tool will come in. You can just pop the center of these clips out, and that kind of unlocks it so that the entire clip can pop free. Now you should have one wire harness connector that needs to be unplugged before this fascia comes off. So it's the one you see here, which should be clipped up to the bottom of your body, roughly in this location. Ours has already been pulled down off the clip, but still needs to be disconnected by pressing in on this thumb tab that you see here, and then pulling the 2 halves apart. Now when you're pulling that harness down, it will be clipped into the frame over here as well in these 2 locations. You do want to try and pull those out of the frame using your panel or clip tool and retain them. However, you can kind of see ours broke here during that disassembly, and there's a chance that yours do the same. From here, the 6 hex head fasteners along the back that are just underneath your hitch should be the last thing holding this on. So take your 10mm and get those removed. Now you do want to retain these last 6 fasteners, as we will trim out and reinstall just a portion of this fascia once the Victory bumper is installed. With those out of the way, you may have to go back out to the outside corners just under the taillights and finish pulling that fascia out of its outside retainers there. You may have to also kind of lift up to get it over the latch inside of here, but you should, generally speaking, be able to just pull back and pull this whole assembly off. With that out of the way, you can come back in and remove this factory Toyota foam section here. That just pulls straight up and can be tossed to the side. Now you may have noticed that our trailer connector was already kind of hanging down throughout this video to this point. That's just because we had it unbolted earlier on in our R&D disassembly. It'll bolt on to the back of this hitch cross member you see here and just have 2 hex head screws that can be removed, again, with your 10mm socket. From there, we just have a few things to clean up here on the vehicle before the bumper can be installed. So one of those, you can get your factory spare tire removed using the factory jack and spare tire removal kit if you're going to be installing a tire out on an adventure carrier, which you should be if you're buying our bumper. From there, we can grab our 10mm socket once again and remove this clip, which will be on both sides of this factory hitch receiver. and then work our way out around the side to get a couple more things removed. Then out here on the corner, you have your upper retainer as well as this lower bracket that can be removed. When it comes to the retainer, it just has one screw up here in the top. And then once you get that out, there is just a clip that holds it in on the bottom. So you should be able to pull straight back. You may need your clipper panel tool here to help you out just a little bit. Then in a similar fashion up here, you have a lower bracket and then this large upper retainer that can be removed. With the screws removed up here, your clip tool comes in handy to pop these 3 retainers as well. And then all of that stuff can just be discarded. So under here, you are gonna have to do a little bit of trimming to make some clearance for your bumper. And that's basically just for the gusset that runs from this outside wing into the frame. Now you can see we've already done some of that. Part of this was kind of just our R&D process and getting everything figured out in here, but we still have enough information to tell you guys what needs to happen. So you can see the piece I'm holding in my hand and how we completely removed that from the vehicle body. You can kind of see if I hold it up here how it nests in and where we kind of trimmed it and removed it from. There is kind of a stamped or molded line right here that you can follow the bottom edge of to achieve a very similar cut right here. But really, from a clearance standpoint, this bottom end we have kind of bent over, if you can see that. That is really all that would need to happen. You're kind of making roughly a ½ an inch of clearance along the bottom edge of this. That's all that needs to happen here on the back in just this section. So it's really just up to you. Basically, if you're concerned in any way about ever going back to stock with this vehicle, you can do the more minor modifications along the bottom and kind of trim things up and even just fold that flange over to make some clearance there. If you just want this to look the cleanest in behind here, make sure you have nothing hanging down and in your way. You can start by trimming this out and removing this entire section. Now as you move forward just a little bit, kind of into this front corner here, there's a little more work that needs to be done. You can see we already have kind of a small squared off cutout in here. That does need to be a little bit larger. That was again something we did earlier on, so you will still have a solid sheet metal section all the way across right here. Basically, you're going to use this round hole and this square hole as your general guides or markers, and you're going to connect just a vertical line along the outside edges of those running down. You're going to bring that all the way up to the bottom of that raised kind of molding flange that I mentioned just a moment ago, and then connect it all the way across here, which will leave you a slightly larger cutout than what I already had in place right there. So with it marked out like that, you're gonna need to cut it out. We're just using a small pneumatic cutoff wheel here. You can use the tools you have available to you, so a body saw, or even carefully with a 4½ inch cutoff, you could likely make this same cut in here. Now there is still just a little more cutting that needs to be done here, so we'll kind of clean up all our rough edges after that. Basically at this point you want to trim the bottom edge of this off all the way around the front as well as toward the back into here. You're basically going up roughly 1/4 inch, or essentially what would be the bottom of the nut that is on the back side of the sheet metal that when you're working on your vehicle you'll easily be able to kind of feel and identify. So that should leave you with something that looks a little more like this. Again, wrap that all the way around the front of this lower tab and then carry that same line back into here. You can see I'm kind of just marking this out freehand, so the measurement isn't super critical as long as you keep those threaded locations in here. Again, only for those of you that think you may ever go back to stock for any reason whatsoever. So once it's marked out, we'll trim these out as well. Once you're happy with your trimming here, again, we'll just come back and clean up all our rough edges, likely with a flat disc or a small 90-degree sanding pad in there. And then we just have to touch up any raw metal edges with some paint, like you can see we've already done a little bit of in here. For that, you can see we used a black paint in here to touch that up, and that's fine because this is all hidden in here behind the bumper. Something we have done in the past, and we may come back and do on this one later on, is actually touch all of this up, basically everything that's tucked in behind the bumper with a black paint, and that just makes it a little more of a subtle transition, kind of just visually to your eye when looking at the gap between your bumper and the factory body lines up here. Now over here on the passenger side, you're doing some very similar cutting, but nonetheless a little bit different. You can see it doesn't have that large section that drops down in the back over on this side, but here in the front you do still have a small square hole, and then this more oval shaped hole slightly to the rear of that you're using as your guide now to make that sort of squared off cutout. And then again, you're coming up roughly 1/4 of an inch again to the bottom of the nuts on those threaded holes here, and just carrying that line all the way back basically to this transition or step in your sheet metal where you can kind of blend those two together. So with this side trimmed properly, you can now get a little better look at what it should look like. And then of course you need to come back in here and clean up those rough edges and once again touch it up with some paint. Before your bumper goes on the truck, we first need to install these tie-in brackets into the frame. So here I have the passenger side and the driver's side. You want to make sure that this bent flange is going to face up and back, and then obviously this flange or flat face out here, this one's going to bolt into the side of the bumper once everything is slid into place. So here is the driver's side bracket that we're going to show you right now. So this bracket is going to go into the end of the tube you see here. This is essentially the receiver tube that runs across the back of the frame. So with the bracket in the correct orientation with this mounting face up and back, you'll go to slide it in and find out that it doesn't slide in all the way. The reason for that is from the factory, the hole that you're trying to line that up with is just punched through with some sort of punch tooling. And what happens is you wind up with a little round or oval, depending on which side of the vehicle you're working on, kind of plug still stuck facing up inside of there that you need to get in there with potentially a long punch or a pry bar and hit that with a hammer and knock that thing out of there so that this can be fully installed. Usually it doesn't take too much force, you just might have to work at it for a second. So just a long punch here and a hammer is all I'm going to use to knock this one out. And then it's not going to hurt to leave that in there, but if you want to recover it with a magnet just to get it out of there, you can. With that out of the way, you can find one of your 1.5 inch long 1/2 inch hex head bolts, ideally with a washer. And you're going to basically slide this in and just test fit it the first time around. So lining it up with that hole, making sure that you can get your bolt started here, and then just taking a quick look to make sure that it sits nicely along all of your mounting surfaces there. We are then going to have to take this out one time so that we can drill 2 holes to accommodate our pre-installed nuts here and get this fully bolted into place. So where are you drilling those holes? On the back of this frame, there's a nice flat kind of mounting surface, if you will, right on this back face. You want to be essentially centered in that vertical flat face. The first hole is going to be also centered horizontally in this opening at the back of this frame rail. So I already made a mark roughly in the center there that we can use to guide our punch, since this is somewhat recessed inside of here and you can't really get a tape measure all the way in against that material. This opening is 1.5 inches wide, so make your mark at 3/4 of an inch. And then, so again, we're drilling 2 holes back here. Your first one is going to be in the center of this opening horizontally, and then essentially what we want to do is center ourselves vertically on the flat surface on the back of the frame in here. So the vertical centering is going to be somewhat visual, admittedly there, and then I made a mark already roughly in the center of this opening. This is 1.5 inches wide, so 3/4 of an inch in here. We'll use that as a guide to kind of center up our punch. And then we pretty much want to go almost as high as we can in here and then make our mark. Essentially it's going to be about as high as you can get with your drill bit without cutting into this top surface.
For your next mark, again, you're gonna try and stay centered vertically in that flat face, but you're now gonna come over 4 inches from the center of your first hole. So I'm just using this edge as a guide actually here, sticking 3/4 of an inch of my tape measure out into that opening, and then coming to the 4-inch mark, we'll make a mark here. And then again, centering vertically is somewhat visual, but if you place a tape measure up here, you'll find out this flat is roughly 1 inch tall before it kind of starts to radius over top and bottom. So you can somewhat use your 1/2 inch mark there as a guide, and then just visually make sure that this appears to be in the same plane as your first mark in your first hole location over here to know that you have these lined up correctly. With both of those marked, you now need to drill. We recommend you drill them to 9/16 so you have a little bit of compliance when getting your bracket installed, and you should be just fine at that 9/16 hole size thanks to the oversized washers on the hardware there. When it comes to drilling this, we are going to use a series of drill bits, so I'm starting with a smaller, about 1/4 inch drill bit and working up to that final 9/16 hole size. Keep in mind that this is about 3/16 to maybe even a 1/4 inch thick, it feels like, down on the bottom side. So take your time, use a little bit of drill lubricant, and you should be fine here. Now you want to test fit the part once you have your holes drilled and make sure that all 3 of your mounting fasteners will thread in easily by hand. Admittedly, just due to the nature of this marking and drilling process, we were just a little bit off on one, so we pulled out a carbide burr on a die grinder, cleaned it up just a little bit, and now we can throw this thing in here and start our hardware. Because of the tight quarters with this kind of overhanging edge of sheet metal here, you want to start this fastener first. That way you can kind of push the tie-in bracket back out of the way enough to work with this bolt a little more easily. So go ahead and thread this one in pretty much as far as you can by hand. Just leave yourself a little bit of room to be able to manipulate the bracket. With that threaded most of the way in, you can take your 2 remaining bolts and start them in this rear and bottom hole. With all 3 started, you want to thread them all in pretty much as tight as you can by hand, and then at least on this outside one here, you have a couple different options. Since you already might have a die grinder out, you can open this up a little bit more if you choose to allow you to get a socket in here, or you can just take a couple minutes with a box end wrench. This one's a 12 point, and then you can just kind of work this until it's tight. Obviously it doesn't take too long here, and depending on what tools you have, a ratcheting wrench may fit in there as well. And then tighten up your remaining 2 fasteners. You can then go repeat this process if you haven't done so already over on the other side. Now the only real difference over on this passenger side is that the factory hole, or the bottom hole in this case, is a little bit more of an oval shape. Here's the kind of knockout that we took out of there to give you somewhat of an example of that shape. And in this location, you'll just be centering your bracket in that slotted hole location. With the bumper hanging on those 6 main mounting fasteners, you'll then come out to the side of your main mounts here. You'll want to have another 1.5 inch long hex bolt with washer here. You want your main mounting hardware to be just a little bit loose at this time, so you can manipulate this up and down as needed for alignment, and you can then pass this through the slotted hole and thread it in. This is going into that tie-in bracket that we installed into the back section of the frame earlier on. Now inside of your factory fascia is going to be a wire harness along with 4 sensors. These are your backup or proximity sensors, and you need to get them out of here so they can be installed into your new bumper. Now we already disconnected one out here on the driver's side of this fascia. You then just need to work your way across and kind of pull all the clips off here that retain the harness into the fascia. And then as you come to each of the sensors, they all kind of have just a standard wire connector like press tab or thumb tab on the one side, and then the other side you will likely need a small pick or flat screwdriver to kind of press in on it, which is the top side here, while you release that thumb tab. There's likely some dirt and stuff built up in these, so you'll have to kind of work at them and wiggle them a little bit.
but you should be able to get those removed, and they'll slide straight back out of their retainers in here. Now with the entire harness and sensors removed, just make sure you're paying attention to which side had the factory harness connection in it that ties back into the body wiring harness, and make sure you reinstall that in the same orientation on your new bumper. Now back in here on the fascia, you do need to save these retainers, if you will, by removing them from the bumper, and then you'll reuse them to snap the sensors into your new bumper. So they just have a small tab on either side here that you can press in on, whether it be with your fingers or with your screwdriver, while pulling out from the outside. You'll probably have to get just your fingernails around the small lip on the outside so that you can add a little tension out there. And once both of those clips are popped, you should be able to press this out of the front, and it leaves you with something like that that you can reuse in your new bumper. Now with both of these parts out of the rear bumper, just to try and give you a better look in a little more detail here, you can now see the tab that you have to press in with your screwdriver. That locks into the slot here on the sensor, and then that small press tab or thumb tab out here on the other side. So with these in the bumper, it'll be clicked all the way in like that, and then again you have to press the one with your finger and release the top with that screwdriver to separate the two halves. Now if you guys didn't notice when you were pulling these retainers out of your factory bumper, two are smaller than the others, so your inside sensors are going to use the larger retainers and the outside sensors use the smaller ones, which we can now snap in to the front face here. So we'll show you one here on the center just because these two are more visible. So I'll slide this in from the outside, kind of orienting that tab in the same way as it was in the factory bumper, and then we'll press this into its location so that you hear it snap in like that, and we know it's properly retained. Then holding that retainer with one hand from the outside, you can snap your sensor in here on the back. Just make sure that that snaps in on both the top and bottom clip. Now when it comes to the two outside sensors, you will likely have to disconnect the wire harness here, so you can just press the center tab and separate those. You'll then be able to pass the harness through the cutout here in the bumper and reconnect it to the sensor, which will be clipped in out there. Now as we were getting our harness connected to all our sensors and getting everything in the bumper here, we noticed that it actually worked out a little bit better on this cage to rotate it 180. So the locating tab that you see here and that we kind of mentioned earlier on actually winds up down on this one. And then as you kind of view them and orient them on the rest of the bumper, it's going to be down, down, up, and down out on that far corner with those tabs to get everything installed properly. Now this is also the perfect time to get a set of pod lights installed if you plan to do so. We give you slotted mounting tabs down inside of each corner of the bumper, as well as a light cutout to accommodate these. So you'll just have to assemble your light per your manufacturer's instructions and then get it installed. Typically they provide you hardware for that as well. Now we're just putting those in kind of hand tight for now, and then you do have access to these from the bottom so that we can get them lined up and tightened up later on once the bumper's installed on the truck. Now from there, if you're installing adventure carriers at this time, you're going to have latch catch brackets. The easiest time to install those is now. That's what the two slotted holes on either side of the hitch are for, kind of on that back face inside of here. There's more detail on how to get these installed in our adventure carrier install video, but generally speaking, it's just two 1/4-20 bolts through here that are a 7/16 hex head. Now we flip the bumper around a bit so you can see the back side here. This is where you're going to need to install the lower trim plates or trim bezels, if you will. These are not side specific, so you just have to kind of flip them and get them in the correct orientation so that they line up with all the mounting holes down here. And then you'll be installing the black 1/4-20 button head bolts from your bolt pack, along with washers and serrated flange nuts on the inside. With those trim plates installed, the bumper is now ready to go up here on the vehicle. We are going to lift this up and just show you one thing to do with the mounting holes underneath on the factory frame. So underneath here, these two holes are what you're going to be using to install your initial hardware with the bumper up in place. This is the hardware you're installing, so these are M12 by 1.25 bolts. You want to at least check that these start and thread in relatively easily into these factory holes. Obviously, depending on the condition of your vehicle and where you live, you might have some rust or corrosion to contend with there, in which case you'll want to clean these out with a tap. And you can probably see on here that ours already have a little bit of anti-seize in there as well from our R&D installation. Once you're happy with that, if you hadn't done so already, you can grab a 19mm socket so you're ready to go for your hardware here, and then grab a friend or two to help you get the bumper slid up on the vehicle frame. Now, the nice part about how they built the back of this frame is there's kind of this nice ledge here that you can rest the bumper on as you're getting it slid in and getting your hardware started, but still, just due to the general size of the vehicle and in turn the bumper, it is pretty large. So what works best is to have one person out on each end and then somebody free to handle the hardware underneath to get everything started. You'll then find these tie-in brackets. These are going to install on the bottom of that center cross member, or hitch cross member if you will. Now, I did get a little carried away during the install of our tie-ins since I told you to tighten all of the mounting hardware. So you may have to remove your one lower bolt down here. This was the location that was the original factory hole. You can then take the single slotted part of this tie-in and thread it back in using that same lower bolt. With the bracket hanging on that first bolt, you'll now find the shorter 1-inch long 1/2-inch hex bolts with smaller diameter washers. You can pass those through each of the holes here and install serrated flange nuts here on the inside. Once you have all of that mounting hardware started on both sides of the vehicle, you'll first want to come back and tighten up the lower mounting fasteners into the frame here. Also stepping back and making sure that the bumper is nice and centered on the vehicle at that time. And then following those, you can come out here and tighten up all your remaining 1/2-inch hardware. With your hardware tight toward the back, you're now going to come up here toward the front where you still have these empty slotted holes. These you're going to be drilling and self-tapping with the 1/2-inch thread cutting bolt that you see here. So we're going to have to first mark this out just using a center punch. We're aiming for about the center of the slot here. We're just using our bumper as a guide for these hole locations. From there, you're going to need to drill a 7/16 hole to be the pilot hole for that thread cutting bolt. Obviously, we're going to start a little bit smaller with a pilot bit and then kind of work our way up to that 7/16 hole size. With the hole drilled out, you'll need a 3/4 socket, and then you can kind of press this up in here and run it in with your impact, cutting those threads along the way. Once you have that done, you'll just repeat that over on the other side. With your hardware tight for your bumper, you can work on tidying up your wiring under here. So that should just be clipping the wire harness connector back in for those rear proximity or backup sensors. You will see here, we kind of rerouted this so it comes up over the top of the frame and the top of this cross member rather than from underneath how it was from the factory. Now, while you're under here working, this would also be a great time to wire in your pod lights. However you choose to do so. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways. Sometimes we just tie them into reverse lights. Other times we know you're running them up to a switch controller all the way up under the hood. So we're not going to go through that step by step just because of how many variations of wiring there could be. Then moving out here, you can reconnect your trailer plug and bolt it into the two provided slotted holes right here on the back face. For that, you're just using more 1/4 button heads like you used on these trim plates. So hardware you're familiar with here. You will have to reach back in here to get the nuts installed. And with both of those started, you can go ahead and tighten them up again with your 5/32 hex. With your bumper now securely fastened in place and everything pretty much installed there, you now need to fill this gap back in with something. And for that, we're gonna have to trim your factory fascia. So I'll grab everything needed for that and show you guys how to mark that out and get it cut. For this, we have a tape measure, a marker that's going to show up on our fascia material, along with a couple different types of tape. So just your standard kind of blue masking tape, and then we also have some 3M fine line tape. We find that this works well just because it's a little more kind of pliable or flexible, if you will, kind of getting around corners or making radiuses, but it works out pretty well for us when marking out our plastic cuts here. So to start out on this, you're going to kind of want to come right up to this top corner. You're basically going to be bringing a line straight down here. It's going to be real hard to see on camera because it's very subtle, but there is a small kind of bend or break, if you will, in the factory molding or body line on this. So you'll use that as a guide, just as a reference. Down here toward the bottom, that winds up being about 2 inches from here out to line up with that line. So I'll first put a piece of tape in there. And then from here, it is kind of just a trim to fit thing to some extent on this. So basically, we're gonna go from this point at the bottom edge of our line now, right over to the front edge of this bump out here, which kind of goes around the factory latch for your hatch on the truck. So we're kind of just trying to stay in line with this edge of it right here where the two kind of surfaces meet. So that, I'm just gonna use my tape actually as the straight edge to come across here and kind of carefully lay it down in here where I want it. This should allow us to get this cut out of the bumper so that we can get it up on the truck and kind of do our final fitment up there. So just to give you another point of reference here, this is somewhat radiused, so these are kind of rough measurements, if you will. You're not necessarily going to be able to hit the exact same spots as me, but over in this corner, for example, that winds up being about 1 inch and 3/16 inch and a quarter out from this crease or seam here. And then if you come about halfway across and do the same thing, it narrows up a bit to be about 1 inch out from there. And then again, you're just carrying that all the way across to connect with your first tape line here. So we'll just go over and do the same thing on this other side before we start cutting. Now when cutting these, we typically wind up using our 4.5 inch cutoff on a grinder, but obviously there's a lot of cutoff tools out there in the world, so use what you have available that suits you best. And there's really no perfect way to go about this. It's just a matter of following your line and getting this separated. Once you have the two halves separated, this part can now just be thrown away, and this we can fit up on the truck and kind of make our final trims and cuts. So up here on the truck, you can reinstall just a couple of your factory bolts to kind of get this thing lined up. Once you have it in place, it's kind of just a personal preference from here how much more you want to trim. So you can look at things like the gap around the outside edge over here under the tail light, how things are looking across here. Once you're happy with that, you got an idea what you want to do, you can just get this back off one time and kind of clean up all your rough edges here. This would also be a good time to just check fitment and clearance by closing the hatch one time as well and making sure you like the appearance there, because some small bits of this edge may be exposed visually with that closed. Now at this point, you need to know whether or not you're installing adventure carriers, or maybe you're just going to add them later on. So to fill the spindle hole locations, we provide you these black plastic caps. We do recommend installing them with a thin bead of RTV sealant around the outside here so that you can then snap them in place and have that sealed up to prevent any water, dirt, debris, whatever it may be from getting in there and causing some corrosion. Now, as for those of you that are installing adventure carriers at this time, you'll first want to check out the adventure carrier installation video. That's going to be the most in-depth overlook at how to get those assembled and installed here on your bumper. And once you've done that, those of you that plan to relocate and rewire your camera as well as your license plate light, you're going to want to check out the Forerunner video that we have posted with our camera relocation kit. Now, I know you're working on a Sequoia here. However, that 5th Gen Forerunner video with Daryl is essentially identical to what you're going to have to do here on this Sequoia. Everything you're going to have to take apart
mimics this very closely. The only real difference that we found is the color of the wire that you're going to be looking for. So when Daryl talks about a gray shielded wire on that, you're going to be looking for a blue shielded wire here on your Sequoia. So aside from that, when he talks about the access panel over here, you have that same thing. You will have to remove this taillight likely to get your wires routed out properly to your carrier on your rear bumper, but all of this headliner and inner trim panel stuff, all the trim panel stuff on your rear hatch and everything on your vehicle is essentially the same. Now, of course, if you get tripped up or confused at all, our customer service team will be happy to help. You can reach out and contact us by email at info@victory4x4.com or by phone at 269-459-8447.